Probably the most famous murder case in Philadelphia history is that involving Mumia Abu-Jamal, a Philadelphia journalist who was convicted in 1982 of the murder of police officer Daniel Faulkner. The prosecution claimed, based on two key eyewitnesses, that the officer was killed in execution style by Abu-Jamal, who was straddling him and firing downward at the sidewalk 4 times, like that, with one of the shots hitting the officer between the eyes and the forehead. The question is, if Jamal had been firing down like that onto the ground and he only hit him once, why were there no marks on the sidewalk from the missing bullets? In the normal crime scene, you'd expect to see those circled, and they were never even identified. So what we decided to do was conduct a test to approximate what happened and see what kind of marks get left. The resulting marks are very, very apparent in any lighting you want to pick.
For this particular experiment, we found a gun similar to Abu-Jamal's. It was the same style. It was a .38 caliber snub nose. The only difference between this weapon and Abu-Jamal's weapon is the manufacturer. This is a Smith & Wesson. Abu-Jamal had a Charter Arms. We used the same types of ammunition that the police claim were in Abu-Jamal's gun, which are high velocity plus P ammunition. Plus P meaning they put extra gunpowder in it to make it of a higher velocity. So we have 2 of those kind. We have a hollow point, we have a metal jacketed, and then this is standard ammunition. It's not the higher velocity ammunition. This is the soft lead plus P. You see that there's a lead mark, and you also see there's some small indentations. On the .38 special regular ammunition, you see small indentations, but you see the large lead splotches from the bullet when it hit. The marks that clearly dug out from the sidewalk was from the metal jacketed, which left a very clear mark. You don't need a microscope, binoculars, or even being a ballistic expert to see that there are marks here. And if in fact the incident took place as the prosecution has contended for nearly 30 years, and as they presented to the jury, then you would have to see these marks.
The police actually, the evidence sheet shows that they found on the sidewalk fragments from 2 copper-clad bullets. So they're looking for bullets, and yet there's no sign that they found any bullet marks on the sidewalk. And if they had found them, they certainly would have circled them the way we've done here.
The police official evidence summary indicates that they found very small fragments, and they found those fragments and recorded them. So one would think that if they were this detailed in finding and recovering small fragments, that they would also have found what should have been obvious marks, but those marks are not seen in the crime scene photo, and there are no notations of those marks in any of the police evidence reports. Not only are we using as a basis of comparison the crime scene photo that was introduced by the prosecution at trial, but there was also a photojournalist who came to the scene before the police crime scene investigators got there, and his photographs show no marks at all.
One of the things we did was take a photograph of the scene. We sent that photograph to Robert Nelson, who is a scientist with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, where he works on the Cassini space probe and does the work of analyzing and enhancing those very dim, poorly lit photographs from deep space. And he subjected the photograph to the same kind of enhancement techniques that he uses to bring out the images of the Cassini spacecraft. And he found nothing. And he pointed out that a hard object is shattered by a bullet. The brightness is enhanced, both because you're, of course, blowing away the dirty concrete that's been subjected to thousands of feet, but also because you're creating fracture lines all through the rocks that reflect light in multiple directions and therefore actually looks brighter. So you should actually be seeing bright spots around the area where Faulkner was lying, and there's nothing like that at all. So it needs to be stressed that the testimony given by these two key witnesses, Chobert and White, clearly are false testimony. It could not have happened the way they described it and have no marks around the body. And in fact, there's good reason to question whether either of those witnesses were telling the truth, even before this test. In the first case, Chobert was said to have parked his car, his taxi cab, directly behind Officer Faulkner's squad car. Chobert, although the jury was never allowed to hear this by the judge, was driving on a license that had been suspended because of a DWI conviction, and he was on 5 years probation for felony arson. That's not a person who you would expect to park his taxi behind a police officer's car. But in any event, the question also was his taxi ever really there? Because photographs of the crime scene show no taxi parked behind the police car. It's an empty space. Second of all, Cynthia White, originally, she claimed to have been standing on the sidewalk near the incident, but the problem with that was that no one else reported seeing her. Not a single other witness saw her. With all of that evidence and the lack of the bullets, we think that this test raises a question whether both those witnesses were lying, and probably that they were coached to lie because of the similarity of the statements that they did make.
Amnesty International in February of 2000 issued this report, and one of the conclusions that they came to was that Abu-Jamal did not receive a fair trial, and one of the bases for this conclusion was that the jury that convicted him did not hear all of the evidence. For example, they didn't hear evidence that there were some questions about the crime scene photo. That was what was claimed by police and also claimed by prosecution witnesses could not have possibly taken place based on adequate and true physical evidence, which the jury didn't hear.
After we'd gotten the results of these tests, we presented the results to the district attorney's office for comment. What they said was, in their response, that many people have questioned this case, raising issues based on their lack of knowledge of the case. Obviously, in this case, it's not true. Linn Washington's followed this case since it happened. He was actually on the scene of the crime within the hour of it happening.
Hours, yeah.
He went over to see it because he'd heard it on his police radio and has followed it ever since. I wrote a book about the case in which I meticulously went through all the transcripts painstakingly. And so we don't fit into that category of not having read the transcripts and not knowing the case. They did not respond at all to the question of why these bullet marks do not appear in any of their crime scene photos.